Okay. The Judiciary Committee will please come to order. Mr. Pogue, please call the roll.
Representatives Benavidez.
Here.
Carver.
Excused.
Harrod.
Here.
Lundeen.
Excused.
Melton.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Weissman.
Excused.
Willett.
Here.
Wist.
Here.
Salazar.
Present.
Mr. Chairman,
Here.
I do have a quorum.
We have a quorum, and we welcome Representative Roberts to the deliberations of our committee. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And the record will reflect that Representative Carver has joined us and Representative Weissman has joined us. So we have a short docket this afternoon. We have, first up, House Bill 1059 with the Honorable Representative Wilson. Welcome to your second appearance before the Judiciary Committee, Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, members of the Judiciary Committee, for hearing this bill. It's always good not to bring a controversial bill to the Judiciary Committee. Trust me, I felt a whole lot less nervous my first appearance here when I had you down here with me, Mr. Chair, but this is one of those moments, just a fleeting moment that I thought maybe I should have gone to law school instead of ed school. But today I'm honored to bring House Bill 1059 concerning a failure to summon emergency assistance. Ordinarily, when I bring a bill, for those of you that have been around here a while, I try to follow three simple rules: brevity, levity, and repetition. Today there will be very little levity because this bill is deadly serious, literally. I will attempt to maintain brevity, however, so I will try to do that so that you're not here all night. But this issue does require serious considerations. I need to let you know, with taking on this bill, my feelings have gone from concern when a constituent brought this issue to me, to anger over the things that I saw that weren't being addressed, to frustration with trying to visit with folks and try to reach common ground, and now determination. So that's the person you see in front of you is the determination guy. I bring this bill today on behalf of Eric Ashby, whose remains were retrieved from the Arkansas River in Fremont County and were finally identified last week. I bring this bill on behalf of a young man from La Plata County who was found in Vallecito Reservoir, screaming for help. He and his companion's canoes had capsized the previous night. The companion was able to swim to the shore, but the Arizona man was not. Instead of immediately summoning help, his companion went home and went to bed. When the Arizona man was pulled from the water, he was in very critical condition. I bring this bill on behalf of a young Alamosa County woman who was abandoned after a horrific head-on collision. The driver of the car she was in did not render aid nor call anyone for rescue. She left behind two beautiful children. Ladies and gentlemen, that's three separate incidents in the last year in the state of Colorado, not addressing anywhere else in the nation. The callousness presented in these cases is more than reprehensible, but we can make a difference and prevent more serious, senseless deaths from occurring. I also bring this bill on behalf of Mallory Finaro, who died in 2002 when a passenger in the car with her left and went on to a party, did not call aid, and she consequently died. Her mother was able to get Mallory's law passed. Then Senator Brophy was Representative Brophy, who ran that particular bill, and in that particular bill was also a duty to call clause, and they couldn't get it done at that time. And we've since had these incidents that have happened. Finally, I bring this bill on behalf of all of us as Coloradoans who may have a loved one in need of assistance in the future. One of us may. So why now and why today? Well, let me share Eric's story with you. The official account from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office was released on July 12, 2017. Now, you remember I pointed out that his remains were finally identified last week. According to the Sheriff's Department, there was an accident that they received word of that a passerby happened to see a raft flip. They sent deputies to check it out, could not see anything, and figured that everyone was safe. Then on July the 8th, the account continues that a family member of Ashby's, reportedly his father, called the sheriff's office and said, "My son's missing." Investigators later concluded this incident was the same one that they had been notified by the passerby earlier, and they launched a missing persons case, as the body had not been recovered. I find it ironic that just yesterday we passed a resolution on missing persons. So this case goes from a chance to intervene and save Eric Ashby, who was hanging on to a rock, to a missing persons case. And then the Daily Record went on to tell the story of what happened. The identity of the people who were with him is known, but I won't mention them here. A month after the accident, his remains were found. That was on July 28th when his remains were found. And because there was no crime committed, put that in quotes, that goes to the bottom of the list. And finally, his remains were identified last week when Randy Keller, the Fremont County coroner, issued the statement that we identified the remains. Let me reiterate. Remember the repetition piece. Ashby was on an excursion with four other people when he was swept away in the fast Class 4 rapids. His companions saw him desperately clinging to a rock, but they didn't call for help. They got in Eric's car and drove home and did not report the incident until 10 days later. Does anyone else see at least one or two things wrong with this picture? Committee members, I think you received an email concerning this incident. I think some people emailed you about that. What you may not know is that there was a petition circulated by Misty Morris, who will be testifying today, that garnered over 60,000 signatures in 20 days. 60,000. People are fed up with what's going on in this type of situation that no one cares to report. It's time we quit looking for what might be wrong with a bill such as this and start looking for what might be right with this bill. Let me tell you what I think is wrong. I think it's wrong that we have a law against cruelty to animals that's a Class 1 misdemeanor and a Class 6 felony if it's aggravated. I think that's wrong because we don't have anything like that for people. I think it's wrong to pass a bill that adds a category of working horses to an existing crime of cruelty to the service animal. And don't get me wrong, I'm not for torturing animals, okay? I love them. I have some, and I ride them all the time. But we just passed another law or moving one forward to expand that class on cruelty to an animal, and yet we somehow do not consider failure to report a human in need as a crime of cruelty to humans. I don't understand that. You abuse a dog, you're guilty of crime. You ignore a human in need of critical assistance, you're home free. You're home free. Just like in the case of the Florida gentleman who was drowning, and teenagers videoed it, taunted him, laughed at him, and walked away. Do you know right now, as the law stands, there are only 10 states out of 50 that have any type of duty to report law, and we're not one of them. Utah currently, as we sit here, they are currently working on one. The people there had contacted me on this one. So folks, you, your child, your parent, relative, or friend can be drowning. You can be hanging on the edge of a cliff, or you are in the last scariest moments of your life, maybe hanging onto a rock in a fast rapid in the Arkansas River. People can watch, and they don't even have to call 911. They can let you fight for your life. They can laugh. They can watch. They can just stand there and let you die, and no charges will be brought against them. Today, you can take a step towards protecting humans with at least a similar protection as afforded our pets. And this does not go as far as I would like it to, because if it went that far, I'd include the aggravated clause on pets to where we protect fighting dogs and chickens, but at least it would be a start. So I ask you to do the right thing and support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Wilson, for your impassioned plea in support of your bill. I know you've been working on this for quite a while, and I've seen you in your stages of anger, frustration, and various other emotions as you've attempted to work this around. But I appreciate the sincerity with which you bring the bill and the difficult situations that you have described. But I'm sure the committee has some questions we'd like to ask. There are some challenges with this bill, as you know, from talking with others. From a legal standpoint, it is somewhat in contravention of hundreds of years of American jurisprudence, in that we do not, in fact, generally have a Good Samaritan duty. But we will explore these issues with you, and would like to welcome Representative Lundin for joining us. Representative Salazar.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I might,
Sure, if you want to respond.
do all of you have the strike below amendment?
001.
L001, yes. Okay. Just wanted to make sure that we were talking about the same one.
Okay, the record will reflect that all members do have the strike below 001. And, okay, please proceed, Representative Salazar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Wilson, for bringing this bill. And certainly we think we all agree on this committee that there are some serious concerns about people not reporting or attempting to save another person's life by calling 911. But this is a concern that I know was expressed by other members of this committee, at least those whom I've spoken with. And so I want to ask you the question. Does the government have a right to compel someone to say something, such as, does the government have the right to force someone to call 911? That's a compelling of speech. Do you know if the answer to that question?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Salazar, for that question. I'd have to go back to when I taught government, when I said that the duty of government was to do for the people what they couldn't do so well for themselves. So I sit here before you as a conservative Republican thinking that me bringing this bill is the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I'm serious about that. But I look at what's happening, and I don't care whether it goes back hundreds of years with jurisprudence or whatever it may be, that there comes a time when I believe that the government should step in and say, somebody needs to protect these people. So that would be my response.
Representative Salazar.
Thank you. And and our duty as a judiciary committee is not only to vet a bill, but also to look at its constitutionality. And whether or not, do we have the right to compel someone to say something? I know that and there's case law on this, that we have a right to compel people to not say certain things. But this is, you're creating a duty to compel someone to do something or to say something, which is an issue. So I was wondering if you've done any research on it, and any legal research, or if you have any legal authority here who can speak to that.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Salazar. I do not have legal folks here to speak to that. In all due respect, I figured we probably had enough of the legal background piece of that. The only thing that I would say is that we do have power as a legislature. This body passed a law not too long ago that said if you thought that a dog in the back of my truck was in trouble, you could break and enter and get that dog out. So we do have the ability to essentially break a law, but make it lawful to do so.
Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative, for bringing this bill forward. When I first saw this bill, I immediately thought of so many of the new kind of the newer trend on Facebook, where we see people who are fighting each other, and people are sharing that and liking it and sending it viral. And that's really disturbing to me. I see it all the time. And I actually recall an instance in, I think, Aurora, Colorado, where that was happening, and a young woman was so traumatized and bullied by it that her mom was afraid for her life, that she might even take her own life. That's happening a lot, right? We're seeing those things go viral, and quite frankly, I think they should stop. So that's what I immediately thought of. And then I started thinking about, well, what about victims of sexual assault? And if you have a victim of sexual assault and she goes to her friend and says, I was just raped. And does that friend then have a duty to go and report that, even if this woman decides that she doesn't want that abuse to be reported? Or if you have someone who, well, in the instance of sexual assault, I think that's really important. So someone who is over the age of 18, who is suffering trauma from an assault, who is not ready to come forward and does not want to go to the hospital, what duty then does that friend or that person who has been kind of a person of solace for this victim, the survivor, what responsibility then do they have to report? And then are they going to be subject to these fines and these penalties that are in the bill?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Herod, for that question. I believe that that's covered in the line 5 and 6. Any person who knows that another person, for someone to tell me that they've been raped or assaulted or whatever, there's a lot more connected with that than if I were visibly viewing that. If I saw someone being raped, then I know that there's something going on. If I saw someone being assaulted, then I would know. So that, to me, is what the intent of those 2 lines are, that we know that. Then, again, we're protected under this. If I report that and it wasn't true, that's one aspect of that. That gets into a different issue.
Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I read those lines, it says, any person who knows that another person is at risk or has suffered serious bodily injury. So the or who has suffered serious bodily injury, I think that you would agree that rape is considered serious bodily injury. And so it doesn't say that the person has to view the rape. It just says that they have to know that that person suffered it.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Herod. That's true, but what I'm saying is, if Representative Carver came up to me and said, I've been raped, how do I know that without viewing it, is what I'm saying. It is seriously bodily harm. If she came up, she's bleeding from the face, she's been beat up, something has happened. So then I would know she's at least been assaulted. I don't know whether sexually or not, but she's been assaulted. So then under this, I would say, yes, I have a duty to call. If she's not able to, or if she tells me don't do it,
Okay.
that's another issue.
Representative Lundin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would ask Representative Wilson if perhaps continuing on that same line 7, the dependent clause and is in need. So the previous circumstances that were just discussed and is in need of immediate emergency assistance shall dial 911, et cetera. I'm just curious if the bill sponsor, that dependent clause provides some degree of accommodation around this particular issue.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Lundin. I believe that it does. I believe it does. It ties in as the knowing that something transpired.
Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you, Representative Lundin, for saying that. Maybe it'd be helpful for some folks to understand what happens to a woman when she's been sexually assaulted. There is, immediate bodily injury that sometimes could result in death if she doesn't seek treatment, depending on how brutal the assault is. But there is emergency medical assistance that's needed afterwards, especially to make sure that she doesn't contract any type of diseases, right? Possibly pregnancy and all these other things that could happen. And so I think that there's not a standard here. Immediate emergency assistance, if someone came to me right then, had been brutally raped and did not want to move forward, I think that would meet this threshold in the bill. But, I think there's other folks who are way more knowledgeable in this area who would be happy to explain kind of what happens immediately after and why there's such recommendations that someone who is sexually assaulted should seek care immediately, but that they're actually not compelled to by our laws, because it should be that victim's right to decide should she or he move forward.
Do you want to respond to that, Representative Wilson? Okay. Representative Benavides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while we're on that line, Representative Wilson, because I certainly understand the terrible situation that you described, and we would hope that our best selves come forward and would seek aid. But there's 2 aspects of that just in the first paragraph. And I'll give you an example, which is a little different than Representative Herod's, which is a true example that happened to me as an attorney. I remember one evening at about midnight, friend came to my house. Half of her face was this big because her husband had just punched her in the face. She came to me as an attorney because he had told her if you leave the house, you lose the house. And she didn't want to get medical help. So she didn't want me to call. And even if I had decided to call, the second part that I have, the person can do so without danger or peril to themselves. If I thought he would come after me as well as her, would that be enough reason not to call? And I'm not even sure what peril means in this context. So, and then if I did, or I didn't, in that case I didn't, I called her daughter convinced her to go and get help. But would I be civilly liable? I know this talks about criminal liability, but let's just say I was charged and I was guilty of the misdemeanor. Would I also then have civil liability from this person not calling 911, even though she didn't want me to call 911?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Benavides, for that question. As far as the immunity, for lack of a better term, I'm not sure what the legal term is, but I believe that that's in point 3, that you would be covered, that you wouldn't be liable. The piece that you're talking about in paragraph 1 up there, starting with line 5, that person is at risk or has serious bodily injury, is in need of emergency immediate assistance, shall call 911. That would be, I think I would have to agree with you, that would probably be a judgment call on your part.
Representative Benavides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to follow up with the civil liability part, at least the way I'm reading paragraph 3, that only would provide me protection. I wouldn't be liable for any civil damages as a result of acts or omissions by that person in rendering aid unless the person acts in a willful, wanton, or reckless manner in providing care, which refers back to the fire department, the medical personnel. So if I called them and then they were rendering the care, because I'm not rendering it, I'm just calling them, then if they do something terrible, I won't be liable for it unless it was willful, wanton, or reckless. But that doesn't provide me civil damages for or protection from civil damages if I just don't call.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that clarification. So some of you attorneys help me out here, okay? Because you're talking to an educator, all right? Isn't there something on the books about duty to provide shelter from a storm or is there something along that line if someone comes to you there that you've got a duty to provide that protection for that person?
Representative Benavides.
There is a requirement if there's a special relationship between parties in some instances where they're required to provide that, but not in all cases. So I just happen onto something and I don't call, and they end up, somebody charges me with the misdemeanor because I never called. What would stop that person then from seeking civil damages against me because I didn't call?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Benavides, for clarifying that. I appreciate that. Like I said, I'm not an attorney. And I'm not sure what would shelter that. I'm really not. I just, as I said, we can look at where we are and consider why something shouldn't be done. But as we say on the farm, what we're doing ain't working. And so consequently, there is that liability of a civil suit. You can't deny that. But I think when I checked, there's less than 50,000 attorneys in Colorado and 5.5 million people. There's a lot of people out there that, like myself, I can tell you quite frankly, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't hesitate. Unfortunately, that's not the case with all. And it's the person that could be motivated just a little bit to take action to save my child, your spouse, your friend. then maybe it's about time that we started pushing back just a little bit on that.
Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wilson, I first of all want to give you a compliment. First of all, you're a good sport to spar with the lawyers up here, and I also appreciate where you're coming from on this bill. I think the examples you provided to this committee are compelling and gut-wrenching, frankly. And I think it really gets to Section 2B of the strike below, which is talking about the person being a direct or proximate cause of the circumstance that resulted in this person being placed in danger. And what I'm struggling with, because I think there are clearly circumstances I can think of. Let's say we have a car accident out here on Colfax this afternoon, and 10 people observed the car accident, and each of those people, maybe in good faith, believes that somebody else is going to call 911, and then no one calls 911. Should we hold them criminally liable for that, as compared with the person who got in the car accident? There's a crime certainly that would be charged if they left the scene, because they're in a position. First of all, they're involved in the accident. There's a legal duty for them to stay. So share with me, as we're sort of comparing sections 1 and section 2B of the bill, evaluate for us, the competing policy reasons there, and how you evaluate the risk, because I think they're two different categories.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative West. Could you tell me again what the question is? I'm not sure what you were asking me to do there.
Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Be happy to. So section 1 of the strike below really talks about a person who is not a participant or an actor in terms of a series of events that places the persons at risk, versus 2B, which is a direct role. You're talking about them being a direct and proximate cause of the circumstance that caused the person to need emergency services. And I'm drawing a distinction between those two. I think section 1 is running against a pretty substantial headwind of decades of common law, which say that you don't have a duty to call 911 or duty to render aid, as the committee's been discussing. 2B is a little different, but I think the culpability there lies under other criminal statutes for the underlying conduct versus failure to render aid. So I guess my question is, do you see that existing law provides sufficient punishment for people who engage in direct and proximate conduct that causes another person to need emergency assistance?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for clarifying that, Representative West. For the most part, I would agree with that piece of it. The intent of this is simply, I'll just use myself as an illustration. If I witness you getting hurt and I don't report that, that's one issue. If I see that you are probably going to die as a result of it, that was the intent of this. If, for example, seeing Eric hanging onto the rock, you probably figured out he's in dire straits. So and in fact, some of you that saw the original bill know that caused a great deal of heartburn when I said, make that sucker a felony, because that's more serious. That's what the intent of that piece is that if it results in death and you didn't do anything, was to allow the judge the flexibility of doing the unclassified misdemeanor, which gives him some flexibility there. So that was the intent of that. But for the most part, I agree with what you're saying, because there are those laws. As I got to researching this, there are a lot of different Good Samaritan laws and that sort of thing that are involved there. But trying to fill in that gap between what's happening and what we should be doing.
Representative Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wilson, thank you for bringing this bill, and I appreciate and am sympathetic to these dire, tragic situations and understand the concern here. My question is, can you tell us about any discussions you've had with law enforcement or the district attorneys on this? Because ultimately, this new statute would fall on law enforcement to determine probable cause, and the district attorneys to try and prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. Have they weighed in or on this bill?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Roberts, and welcome to the group. It's a new face from when Mr. Chair and I were here before. have not had a conversation with law enforcement, have had a lot of conversations with the DAs. The first one just about sent them into cardiac arrest, and I thought I'd probably have to call 911 on that deal. But we have had conversation with that, and quite frankly, that's where the strike below came, sitting down and trying to figure out a way to try to move that needle towards doing something and not really getting them to where they were that upset about it. And I think, unless I hear otherwise, as of today, that they were neutral with it at this point. So, but the first round, yes, I heard a great deal from them.
Representative Willett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Rep. Wilson, for this bill and the good discussion. So turning to the strike below, the title of the bill originally, and still title, is about summoning, notifying, calling first responders. But this section 3 of the strike below causes me concern because it starts speaking about rendering aid and about civil liability. So to me, that's a pretty big shift from a bill talking about notifying authorities to a bill that's also talking about rendering aid. And I don't want to talk about some of the ambiguities that are created. I just want to ask what your intent was in going down the aid route.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Willett, for that, because I know you had brought that up to me, and so I checked with the drafter, and the intent of that was to, if you decide to take action, you're okay, that you're covered from civil liability. That was the intent of that piece. I said, do we need that in there? She said, well, if you're going to protect, you need to have it, because as I read that, if you go on down to about line 25. Is not liable for any civil damages as a result of acts or omissions by that person in rendering aid, unless you do it in a willful, wanton, or reckless manner, was to protect the person who not only summoned 911, but also decided that they were going to help. In this illustration I was giving with Representative Wist, if he's bleeding profusely and I go ahead and put pressure on that just to keep him alive until they get there, that if I didn't do it quite right, I'm still protected. That was the intent.
Representative Salazar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just Representative Wilson, Mr. Chair and I were just talking about this just a bit ago. Last year, and members, you might remember this, last year we had victims' rights groups come to this committee on a bill to remove mandatory reporting. And we all voted in favor of stopping that duty. And we did it because victims were afraid to go to mandatory reporters, whether it was a hairdresser, whether it was counselors, whether it was doctors, or what have you. They were concerned about that. And so CICASA and others asked us to remove that mandatory reporting out of statute, which we did. This bill puts it right back in, but in those prior bills, that was a special relationship, this mandatory reporting, and this here is everybody. Everybody has to call 911 if they know that another person is at risk of or has suffered serious bodily injury. So what I see you doing with this bill, I completely respect the spirit of this bill, but what you are doing with this bill is putting right back in what we removed just last year by a mandatory reporting of everyone now, if they know that someone is at risk or has suffered serious bodily injury. How do we reconcile that incongruence, Representative Wilson?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Salazar. And please don't take this as being flippant. I'm not. But each year I'm here, we go back and correct something that we had done before to try to make it better, to address what we need. And so it's, I mean, and I'm not saying what we did last year was wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that once we do something up here, it's not necessarily set in stone. We come back and change those things. The thing I would like to point out, Representative Salazar, is we said this bill says that everybody has to report if someone is in serious danger. What is wrong with that?
We'll take that as a rhetorical question, Representative Wilson, and not respond. Representative Lundin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So, Representative Wilson, as we walk through and talk through, and we were talking about it earlier, kind of this threat of re-victimization of people, someone who doesn't want you to call, does not want you to reach out and summon help because they would find that contrary to their best interest. And the questions you're just asking or just engaging with here, do you believe that line 11, 10 and 11, where it says that you're responsible for making this effort to summon to the extent that the person can do so without danger or peril to himself, herself, or others. Do you think that the victim, the person for whom help would be summoned, in fact falls in that category of others and therefore could say, please don't call on my behalf, I don't want to be acknowledged in this circumstance? Is that how you perceive that particular portion of the bill?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Lundin, for that question. I would say yes, because the intent is not to put anyone at peril, at risk, or further risk, but it's simply for those who are in need, that we do call.
Representative Benavides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Wilson, on the very beginning, when you say they should dial 911 or shall use another means to summon the police, knowing that in our state we have a lot of areas where there's not great cell service, or we may be somewhere, before this meeting started, I forgot my phone. I didn't find it. So you don't have a phone or you don't have service. What did you intend to mean, use another means? Should I run house to house or stand in the street and scream? What's the other means besides 911?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Benavides, for that question. Living in an area where that's a little splotchy, and we also have fiber optics cut, and we have no 911 service for a day at a time. My intent on that is, again, using the common sense piece. If I see someone, for example, that's in trouble in the river, then I can drive to the next town, contact the police, whatever. In my case, I'd go upriver or downriver. I would know exactly how far I was away from the area. In the instance with Eric, it's not too far from those rapids where that happened to the city of Canyon City, to where they could have gotten a hold of the folks and said, there's some people in trouble. So it depends on where you are and what opportunities are available. But you can notify someone who's in authority or in contact with authorities that could get some help there.
Any other questions for the bill sponsor? Seeing none, let's move to witnesses. Representative Wilson, do you have something you'd like to call, or would you like me to just go down the list of...
Do we have anyone that's in opposition, Mr. Chair?
We do indeed.
I would like to call those first, please.
Carrie Lynn Thompson. Welcome to the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Thompson. You know the procedure, so please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Carrie Lynn Thompson. I'm with the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar, and we are in opposition to this bill, not because we are not equally troubled by the fact that some of these examples that Representative Wilson gave are very troubling. But that being said, this bill does create a new crime for failure to call 911 and summons emergency assistance for someone that is in need of emergency assistance. And I apologize, I have not seen the strike below, but I am testifying conceptually, at least at this point in time, to the very concept of what, for lack of a better term, is a Good Samaritan law. And while many people feel that there is a moral, thank you, obligation to respond as a good Samaritan. There is a big difference between a moral and ethical responsibility and a legal duty to act. And in most states, as you've already heard, there is no legal prohibition against being a bad Samaritan. You can walk past a person who's in obvious distress and do nothing. Now, there are some states that I was able to determine have some laws similar to this: Minnesota, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin. But those laws were different than the one that is proposed here. Specifically, those states are basically the outliers. There are also some states that talk about civil liability versus criminal liability. But this bill makes it a much more serious crime than those states that do currently have the crimes on the books. And specifically, and I'm not sure if the strike below removes the felony. It did. None of them, I was going to testify, actually brought it to the felony level. So it really comes down to, with there just being a few states doing it, it becomes down to whether this state wants to be in the minority and require people to be mandatory Good Samaritans. And we recognize at the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar that it is a very controversial issue. And in reading some of the articles out there that came to light in Florida, in the example that was given of the person who was drowning, and there were kids, teenagers that were photographing it and not taking it seriously and not reporting the crime. In that very same state, they were comparing it to the group of people that formed a human chain to save the person that was drowning in the ocean. Basically, that's the way of the world. It comes down to whether you want to legislate morality. And maybe I'm idealistic, but I'd like to think that more often than not, people don't need a law to do the right thing. And it's a very slippery slope to start legislating morality, and I submit that's why most states have not done it. It's also interesting, if you think about just this last legislative session, there was a bill where that concerned immunity for those people that were using drugs together, and there was a heroin overdose, and seeking immunity for that person to call 911. And that was a similar issue in that we were trying to promote people to do the right thing, and by making it easier for them to do the right thing. And that was something that you as legislators struggled with at that time. It's very, very difficult. But as it relates to how this bill would work in practicality, it comes down to, I'll just give a different example than some of the examples that have been given. If you have a person who, let's say her name is Jenny, and she sees her cousin committing an assault, and that person the victim of that assault is laying on the ground, and her cousin runs away. He doesn't know that she saw him. She isn't put in a position that she can either call 911 and go against her family or not. And that's a very difficult thing. And we would hope she would do the right thing and call 911. But do you want to make her a criminal for that kind of behavior? And that's exactly what this kind of law would do. And it is a long-standing tradition that we do not legislate morality, and these Good Samaritan laws are very rare. So we're asking you to oppose this bill on those grounds. And I haven't had a chance to look at the, if I may, just in case there's a comment I may have on it.
Sure, take your time.
I've had an opportunity to look at the strike below, and it would still be our position that we would ask you, we still oppose this bill based on the grounds that I already mentioned.
Okay. Ms. Thompson, could you tell us, you've obviously looked into it, what some of the other states are doing that have legislated Good Samaritan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes. Rhode Island has a law that basically says any person at the scene of an emergency who knows that another person is exposed to or has suffered grave physical harm shall, to the extent that he or she can do without danger or peril to himself or herself or to others, give reasonable assistance to the exposed person. However, they make that a petty misdemeanor, and it basically in Rhode Island would be a $500 fine. It could be up to 6 months jail. Vermont, it's just a fine only, and it is similar language that Rhode Island has. Minnesota, again, is a petty misdemeanor and a fine only. It's not considered a crime specifically, but just a petty misdemeanor, and they put in the language that it's not considered a crime. Similar language as the other two. And then Wisconsin was a state that talks about a crime being committed, and that's just the other component. Some of these laws refer to there being a crime being committed as well as the person needing assistance, and that's the case in Wisconsin. And that is a Class C misdemeanor, which is up to 30 days in jail and $500 fine. So only 2 of them that I found even made it a potential jailable offense. So that's the research I was able to.
Okay, thank you. Any Representative Salazar?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Thompson, for being here. And hopefully you heard the dialogue that I had with Representative Wilson about this, particularly about the bill that we passed last year to stop with mandatory reporting on sexual assaults, domestic violence, things of that nature. Your reading of L001, does it appear to you, as it seems it is to me, does it appear to you that now everybody is a mandatory reporter, doctors, hairdressers, everybody that we said last year we're going to stop the mandatory reporting because it was not helpful? Does it now appear to you that this bill makes everyone a mandatory reporter, lest they have some type of criminal conviction?
Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Salazar, yes, I can see that. I mean, specifically, that's why we are opposing this bill. It makes it a crime to be a bad person, for lack of a better word, or a bad Samaritan. And it is therefore also requiring people to be mandatory reporters.
Representative Salazar.
And not necessarily that they're bad people. It could be that you have a doctor, as Representative Herod was pointing out, you have a doctor who has a patient come in, the patient's beat up, the patient doesn't want, the patient was involved in a domestic violence situation, the injuries are serious, there's serious bodily injury, and the victim does not want that reported. Under this particular law here, now the doctor, whether regardless of the witnesses or the victim's wishes, now the doctor is forced to dial 911 because they have suffered a serious bodily injury and is in need of immediate emergency assistance. Am I reading that correctly?
Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Representative Salazar, and it's interesting too, in some of the research that I did, that's where a lot of the civil liability was coming through, because they were finding that doctors and nurses and first responders that were off duty were conflicted because of the potential liability that existed for them. So those individuals are particularly conflicted in these situations.
Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Thompson, if I could just have you focus on Section 2B of the strike below. which I think really is a different circumstance other than a Good Samaritan law that, and similar to the laws in other states that you described. So can you think of a circumstance where under our existing law, a person is a direct and proximate cause of another person to need emergency assistance? Let's say they assault them or hit them with their car and fail to or do not notify emergency assistance. Could that be an aggravating factor that could be taken into account by a prosecuting attorney in terms of charging that offense?
Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wist, there are, and I would like to review my statutes, but there are statutes in existence that deal with what happens if you are the cause, and what your, the most obvious that comes to mind is that you're supposed to stay at the scene. Right. That's the first one that comes to mind, and I would have to make a determination after reading the statutes if there's an additional requirement to render aid, et cetera. I don't know that off the top of my head, but at a minimum, you're supposed to stay at the scene.
Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, is there a way to read paragraph 2B consistent with existing criminal law, such that we're not essentially creating a new duty, but essentially codifying that that's something that happens currently under existing criminal practice, that this is used as a fact or a factor that may be relevant to how a particular act is charged?
Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wist, if I may have just a moment just to read it more clearly. Representative Wist, this is, the way it reads, a lot of red flags actually go up, because you have the language that the person is, so the person is the direct or proximate cause of the circumstance. So let's use the car example. And another person, okay, and that person is in need of emergency assistance, and the other person dies as a direct result of the failure. So, so I know for sure you must stay at the scene, but I would have to review, to be honest with you, I'd like to review the actual statutes of whether you then have, as the person who caused the accident, the requirement to render any kind of aid or to call the police. There's, because now it is connected to, the death is connected to the failure to get assistance versus just the accident itself. And I don't believe that current criminal law really gets into that detail at this point in time, but I would want to refer to the actual statutes surrounding vehicular assault and homicide.
Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it'd be fair to look at existing criminal law to see whether or not this principle is reflected there, because I can certainly think of a circumstance where I get into an accident. Let's say I hit a person on a lonely country road and there is no one else around. I do stop, so I fulfill my statutory obligation to remain at the scene, and I do nothing, and the person dies. And I certainly think if I'm a prosecuting attorney, that the failure to act in that circumstance would be something that I would take into consideration as I'm charging that particular offense, versus somebody who gets in the accident and immediately, tries to obtain emergency aid. So I don't necessarily have a solution, but what I do see in 2B is a principle that I think either should be reflected in existing criminal law, or we should at least give prosecuting attorneys the tools to consider that and how an offense is charged. So I appreciate the dialogue. Thanks.
Representative Lundin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Thompson, thanks for being here. Earlier in the hearing, the idea of state-compelled speech was raised. I'm curious if you think this strike below the bill, the concept, rises to that level of state-compelled speech, and your perspective on the relative appropriateness of state-compelled speech.
Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Lundin, I did not consider state-compelled speech until I heard it mentioned by Representative Salazar. I was looking at this, and members of my policy group were looking at this more as state-compelled action, a duty to act rather than to speak. So I did not see that in any of the articles that I was reading about. I read a lot of articles on the debate on whether we should legislate. And one of the articles I read was, should we legislate a duty to rescue? I did not see any articles really addressing it on the topic of state-compelled speech. It really comes down to years and years of the concept that we do not legislate a duty to rescue. And when I was researching it, there was actually an interesting quote by Supreme Court Justice Kennedy, who acknowledged that, and if I could find his quote, he acknowledged in oral arguments when they were in 2012 hearing oral arguments on the Affordable Care Act, Justice Kennedy said, "You don't have the duty to rescue someone if that person is in danger. The blind man is walking in front of a car, and you do not have a duty to stop him absent some relation between you." And he cited the fact that there may be moral criticisms to that rule, but that's the rule. So that's basically what I was finding in the research. I did not find anything on the concept of compelled speech.
Representative Lundin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. But while we're here, the appropriateness of state-compelled speech, your thoughts?
Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Lundin, I keep coming back to the right not to incriminate yourself. That's the most I can equivocate it to. That would not be the reasons why we would oppose this bill specifically, but thinking about it now, it would be something I would want to look at more and actually research more on the concept.
Any further questions for Ms. Thompson? Seeing none, we thank you for your testimony and for researching this issue. I appreciate your diligent testimony to us. Thank you. Beverly, let's see, you want opposition. I don't see anyone else in opposition. I did receive, excuse me, please step forward and identify yourself and.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I signed up kind of late over there. So yeah, my name's Greg Stritsky, and I'm a citizen. I represent myself. And I'm kind of 50% for the bill and 50% against it. I understand what it's like not to receive assistance. Just recently, I went in the middle of the night, got off the bus, and saw someone getting beaten up and kicked on the ground, and rushed to their assistance. I don't have a phone, but my instinct is to go and help run into danger and help people. And then they wanted to go beat me up, and so I had to run out in the middle of the street trying to flag people down, and had about 6 cars drive past me. No one wanted to stop and come to my assistance until a lady did, which I'm very thankful for. But I do like to raise some concerns with the bill. I think a lot of people will be charged under the bill. Like, for example, and I'll just list some anecdotal examples or some examples, like in a botched burglary, where say maybe you have 5 people robbing a house, and say they shoot the homeowner, and all the burglars decide to run, and later they get caught. All 5 of those burglars will be charged under this law. Or say another example, like in a domestic violence situation with the children hiding in the basement, be charged or be subject to this bill. I don't think they would get charged, but I think the way the bill is written, it says they would. And also another example would be the spectators of a drunken brawl on Saturday night in Lodo. Would all the spectators be charged? And also I'll mention too that any witness of a crime who failed to report in a timely manner would be charged. And say that that witness got caught up in a police investigation days or months later. They too could be charged. And so I think this bill would slap a lot of people with misdemeanors, and possibly rightfully so. I don't think people should be just let people sit there and die. I mean, I think that's wrong, of course. But I'm afraid this law will crowd our jails and court dockets, and I don't know if the state can handle that caseload. And I also, as I said, I also wonder if it would discourage people in being open to the police days later during a police investigation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stritzky. We appreciate your insights. Any questions for this witness? Seeing none. Again, thank you. You attend a lot of our hearings, and I commend you for your coming to the defense of a person in need. Commendable spirit. Thank you. As I started to say, I did receive a statement from the Colorado Bar Association. They remain opposed. They will not be testifying, but they did state that their civil rights section, their criminal section, and their health care section are all in opposition to this bill. You want supporters? There is a Beverly Sandberg who has signed up in support of the bill. Ms. Sandberg, are you available?
A little nervous now after all this conversation.
We thank you very much, Ms. Sandberg, for coming forward. If you would, just identify yourself, tell us your name, and tell us if you represent any organizations or groups, and provide us with your testimony.
Bev Sandberg, and I do not represent any group.
Very good.
I'm here to represent people in need, I guess. I brought my daughter's picture. This is Mallory, and this is her 8th grade promotion, and she was dead less than a year after this picture was taken. Representative Wilson mentioned her story a little bit. She was in a rollover accident in rural Colorado on a rural road at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of February. It was 28 degrees outside, and she was pinned from the waist down. There was a young man that was with her in the accident, and he left her there and went back to the party and did not tell anybody. I had the police searching for Mallory, and she was found hours later. Her temperature was more life-threatening at that initial point than her injuries were. And in the world of medicine, there is something that's called the golden hour, in which if somebody in a traumatic event receives emergency medicine within the first hour, it increases their chances of survival. And my daughter missed her golden hour. She was flown out to Denver Health. She lived for 17 days, and she succumbed to not necessarily her injuries, but the complications caused by the hypothermia as part of that. When we learned Mallory had been left to freeze to death, I thought she was with the only person on the planet that would do something like that. And regrettably, I was wrong. It's in the news all the time, and I have met people. I have met many people, actually, that have experienced something similar. And we consider this unconscionable behavior. I'm also a Republican. I don't believe in legislating that you should legislate everything and that less government is better. But when you have people who can't even be compelled to dial 911 when they see somebody that is in a life-threatening situation, it's hard to fathom. When I could not understand why the boy was not going to be charged for leaving my daughter, how that could not have been a crime, the district attorney told me that a 4-year-old could be drowning in a pond, and you can sit there and watch him drown. You have no, you're not compelled to do anything, and not even call 911 unless you're a parent or you're the one that put them there. And to me, that was unfathomable, and that still is. So as was said, there's 10 states that have these measures on the books already. And it's a sad reality that we have to be here even talking about this today. And not everybody is heartless. Not everybody would idly stand by. But for those who can witness a tragedy and not be moved to dial 911, there needs to be a deterrent. And what happened to Eric, what happened to Mallory is unthinkable. There's a lot of good people in this world. They're honorable and compassionate. But to paraphrase Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I know from my own experience with trying to get my daughter's law passed that there were changes in the language to make it more acceptable. And so I don't know if there's something that would be helpful that way that can meet the spirit, but yet protect victims that don't want their situations reported. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sandberg. Are there any questions for Ms. Sandberg? Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to thank you so much for coming and say I'm very sorry about what happened to your daughter. It's quite tragic. I know it can be pretty difficult to come before a committee like this, and especially sharing such a personal story. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much.
And she expressed the feelings of the committee in general. So thank you for joining us and
very much. Thank you.
contributing to our deliberations. Bridget Serrett. I see you're from Colorado Springs. Let me offer you a kind welcome from Colorado Springs myself.
All right.
Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. So we know we have awesome people in the house.
Indeed.
All right. My name is Bridget Surratt. I do not represent anyone on this bill, and I'm here to testify in favor of this bill. This bill simply requires somebody notify emergency services as soon as they possibly can. So if you're in a canyon and you can't have signal, that's okay. You just notify as soon as you possibly can. And that can also be done with anonymity through Crime Stoppers. I know I've actually had to use that service quite a bit. And if a victim, and that's only if a victim would be in peril and somebody witnesses it. Colorado actually does have a mandatory reporting law already for vehicular accidents. You can file online or you can call the police. So we already actually do legislate state speech, just so that we understand that this is actually very similar to the vehicular accident reporting. So you are already required to report any accidents in a timely manner to the DMV. So, and I also have seen several bills pass out of committee that did have issues with things like the victims opting out and creating lesser penalties. That can be done through House amendments and Senate amendments as well after it passes through committee. So those are things that we could be willing to look for and look at. So just so everyone knows my position on this, I actually was a friend of Eric Ashby. We did not know for 12 days, the friends here in Colorado, his family's out of town. They found out 10 days after he disappeared that he had actually disappeared. We found out 12. That led to an almost 2-week delay in search efforts and a body that was so badly decomposed, it took up until last week for this body to be identified. Had we known earlier, our group, as we did search efforts, actually had a military cartographer provide maps to the Fremont County Police Department, and he was found where we had thought he would be. But that process could have been started a lot sooner. The family could have had more closure. And the other issue with this is that the 4 friends that left Eric got into his car, drove away, and kept all of his possessions without any type of crime involved for them not reporting this. His sister had no ability to retrieve any of the possessions, and Colorado Springs Police Department did not have any ability to enforce that. With a crime, Colorado Springs Police Department would have actually had the ability to allow for Lisa, his sister, to go in there and get the possessions because they were in Colorado Springs at the time. To this day, the possessions have not been returned. As you know, the accident was originally reported on the day that it happened to Parks and Recs, but because there was no 911 call, all search efforts were called off. Had the party or anyone called 911, search efforts would have continued. And while the civic responsibility to call EMS seems like common sense, there are several stories, including the Florida man who drowned, but one that you guys might not be so familiar with. The story of Kyler Nipper was a student in a D11 school, stabbed, left bleeding in a bathroom, and is actually protected under another statute to where the teachers did not have to call 911, and they did not call 911. When Kyler was essentially escorted to emergency services and got treatment, he had puncture wounds to organs. It was that serious. This bill would place some accountability on those witnessing someone in distress to simply call 911. They are not required to provide any assistance whatsoever. And if the reporting of 911 would cause the victim or themselves to be in peril, that protects them. This bill will protect them from that. This bill is also important for Colorado as we are a huge tourism state, and not just a tourism state, but an outdoor recreational state. Colorado is one of the best playgrounds in the United States, and I can tell you, if my family were to come here, I would want somebody to report if they were in an accident. I wouldn't want to find out 10 days later that they were missing. I wouldn't want to find out 10 days later that there was an accident and then not be able to do anything about it. And I think that is all I have for you. Oh, other than that, this story actually did make national news. And it was kind of an embarrassment that we didn't have any way to at least hold the four who left him somewhat accountable so that we could retrieve possessions and so that the family could find out what was going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Surratt. Any questions for this witness? Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for telling your story, and I'm sorry this happened to your friend. I'm struggling somewhat with why laws relating to conversion and theft wouldn't be available to family members to return possessions, and I'll just sort of leave that as an aside. But the issue that I wanted to ask you about relates to the actual circumstances of the accident, because it was my understanding, based on my own independent research, that someone did call 911 shortly after the accident when they saw the raft overturned. So is that not accurate?
No, actually, Parks and Rec. Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Parks and Recs was called, not 911. Mm-hmm.
Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you share with us what specifically what information was provided to Parks and Rec? Was there?
Yes, actually. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I know for those listening in, those few dozens. Right? I do listen to these things online, so I know. No, I'm sorry. Could you please repeat the question?
Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question is, what information was provided to Parks and Rec when the call was made?
Ms. Surratt.
Parks and Recs received a call, and the gentleman was a photographer from one of the rafting companies. I spoke with him, and he basically just let them know that somebody went into the rapids at Sunshine Falls, and then that was it.
Representative Wist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one brief follow-up. So under that scenario, looking at the language of the bill, would Parks and Recreation have had a legal obligation to call 911 at that stage?
Ms. Surratt.
This was in the Royal Gorge where this happened, and it is under Parks and Rec's jurisdiction, and it would be up to them to call.
Seeing no further questions, we thank you for your testimony this afternoon. And Misty Morris. Good afternoon, Ms. Morris.
Good afternoon, thank you.
Please, if you would, identify yourself. Tell us if you represent anyone and provide us with your testimony.
I do not represent anyone. My name is Misty Morris. I'm here from Salida, Colorado. I would like to read a written statement from Eric's sister, Lisa, if I may, as well as add some thoughts of my own.
Sure. What was Lisa's name?
Lisa Albritton, Albritton.
Very good. Please proceed.
My name is Lisa Albritton, and my little brother is Eric Ashby. I come before you as a voice for Eric. On July 10th, I found out he was missing. My brother and 4 additional people were in the Arkansas River in Canyon City, Colorado on June 28th, 2017. An apparent accident, as I understand it, and all but Eric were able to walk away safely. None of the individuals that were with Eric at the time of the accident attempted to let anyone know about it until July 8th. 10 days had passed before letting anyone know what had happened. After what seemed like an eternity filled with pleas from my heart, I came to find out that one of the 4 people finally admitted that Eric was swept down the river and they left him. The individuals did not call 911. They did not yell for help. They simply did nothing. If they would have reported what had happened to authorities, my brother might still be here. My family and I have been living daily with this horrible nightmare, and the 4 people who were with him were allowed to legally walk away as if nothing had happened, as there is no current duty to report law. This must change. We need a law for this change. We need Eric's Law in each and every state, beginning in Colorado. People need to take responsibility for their actions, and people need to be held criminally liable for not making an attempt to help someone in a dire, life-threatening situation. I am not asking that anyone place themselves in harm's way, just that they be required by law to seek help. I need justice for my brother, and I feel this is a step in the right direction. I want to protect other individuals. I want to spread awareness. If someone witnesses an individual in a clear state of distress, there needs to be a legal obligation to help this person by calling 911. Please support Eric's Law and all the families that have lost loved ones from a senseless act of someone not reporting an emergency. I have to live my life with this haunting me. Please make this change and help me to get Eric's Law in the books so that no one else will have to endure the pain I feel in my heart. Thank you. Lisa Albritton.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. I appreciate the information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any other witnesses who would like to testify? And did you want to testify as well?
Yes, sir. I would like to offer my own experience.
Sure.
In 1997, a very close friend of my family had gone away to college. She had been born and raised in Colorado. She was a resident of Monte Vista. And one night, she was out with a gentleman, and they were on a rural highway at night, and he rolled the vehicle. He was able to walk away. He left my friend, Leslie, laying there to bleed to death. And when I, as a young person, digesting this information, knowing that nothing would happen to him, the message that sent to me was that Wyoming, the state where this happened, they saw people as expendable. They didn't matter. People could walk away. It was okay. And that was the message that was given to me then, and this is the message that's being given to Coloradans now. It's a message being given to our tourists. They're expendable. You know, somebody can see you in clear distress, and their indifference is perfectly acceptable. Their indifference is more important than your life. That's the message that's being sent. When I started a petition in August of 2017 to gauge the public's reception, I just wanted to see how the public would feel. The response was overwhelming, and I was getting messages from people from all over the state just absolutely flabbergasted that we didn't already have this on the books. People already, you know, they accept it already. You know, they were just dumbfounded that it wasn't on the books already. And, you know, I received in 20 days on my petition 60,420 signatures. That's 20 days. People want this law. I have heard nothing but support for it. You know, I hope you all will feel the same way. This is something that Coloradans and the tourists to our state deserve. And, you know, I've heard people say you can't legislate morality. Well, isn't our system of laws based against immorality? You can't kill somebody. You can't vandalize their property. You can't steal from them. Why is it okay to leave them alone to die? It's not. People see that, you know. They recognize that. People want this law.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Are there any questions for this witness? We thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Please come forward. And if you would, when you're concluded your testimony, could you sign up on the sign-up sheet on the side?
All right.
Thank you. Please identify yourself, tell us if you represent anyone, and provide us with your statement.
All right. My name is Jessica LaRue. I am a member of the Park County Search and Rescue Team, but I am not representing them specifically, but my experiences in that context are going to color my testimony today. On my couple of years that I've been on the Search and Rescue Team in Mr. Wilson's district, which we are appreciative of some things he's done for our team. So we have had most of the missions that we've had to go on to look for people who are lost in the vast area of Park County, which has a lot of trailheads and not a lot of people, are due to failure to report, due to somebody not reporting somebody missing. Now, I've been on a mission where we went to look for a family of 5 that went hiking, never came back. One member of the family left for, he was in his 50s, he left a 13-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 24-year-old behind on the trail and walked out, went into his tent, slept until 11 o'clock the next morning before calling us to report that he had left all of the children that were in his responsibility on the mountain. He had no idea where, with no water, no jackets, in a rainstorm. They were from Kansas. They were not prepared at all to be at 9,000 feet in altitude. They summited over 11,000 feet in altitude during their 17 and a half hours of walking through the woods after he left them before we even started to look for them, which of course made our mission of looking for them much, much, much harder, because the entire time that he was sleeping in his tent, they were continuing to walk through the dark, off the trail, deeper and deeper into the McCurdy Brookside trailhead area, which is very rugged. This is just one incident out of maybe 80 or 90 missions that I've been on in the last 2 years where something like this has happened, simply because somebody went off at a trailhead by themselves. Nobody knew where they were. So when we talked about this being a tourist state, when Ms. Sarrett mentioned that, that's a really valid factor. A lot of tourists come to Colorado by themselves. You come here on a business trip, you've got a half day left over, and you've got a rental car. There's a map. You don't really know where that is exactly, and you don't have anybody that you've told where you're at. The only person who might be able to help you is somebody who saw you at a trailhead, or somebody saw you out on the trail. The fact that that person doesn't have cell reception right there doesn't make it okay or helpful that when they got back to Bailey or back to Fairplay, they didn't just say to the hotel manager or somebody that could use a 911 service, mention it. You know, hey, we were out and we saw a couple, looked like maybe they had some altitude distress, looked like maybe they were having, you know, no water, no food, and were tired and just sitting by the side of the trail. That little bit of information is so helpful to first responders. It's critical. We have gone on many missions where we have recovered a dead body. It's not. It causes PTSD in those of us who do this work. It's a volunteer, we're not paid, and this is kind of ridiculous. Now, I am personally, because I knew Eric Ashby, I met him through marijuana activism, which you all know I'm here for that all the time. I'm really here for the civil asset forfeiture bill that's next. But this bill speaks to my experiences, and Eric was somebody that I met through his activism because he came to this building to talk to you about things that were going on. And he lost his life, so he can't keep coming back. Some people might be relieved that one more marijuana activist isn't going to keep coming back to this building. But
that's a little inappropriate.
I'm based on my experiences.
That's LaRue.
But I sat here and I heard Representative Wist say that he doesn't want to criminalize indifferent people when last year he criminalized indifferent plant counts in innocent patients who have committed no crimes, personal residences. This is the height of hypocrisy. People who are indifferent commit the crime of moral bankruptcy. People who are in their homes innocently trying to grow their own medicine are being victimized by being criminalized. You want to send them to jail on a felony. At the same time, you do not want to have any criminal responsibility for someone who did not report a crime to a friend, stole that person's car. I mean, there is more going on here than just indifference. This is moral bankruptcy, and if the state of Colorado wants to participate in that, we have been going down that road with a police state, with a ton of things that have been going wrong in this state for a long time. And this bill just illustrates the height of hypocrisy, that most of the people on this panel voted to support criminalizing a plant count, but are afraid to criminalize protecting the rights of a domestic violence against their wishes. I'm sorry, but I have a really hard time with that, because I understand where you're coming from with your mandatory reporting stuff, but shouldn't protecting somebody who's a victim of domestic violence supersede their desire to be abused? Because I honestly think we're not really doing a good job if we think it's okay just to let somebody continue to be abused. And that's really not the intent of this bill, but it kind of upsets me that we're going to use that as an excuse to regulate moral indifference, and I don't approve of that.
Any questions for Ms. LaRue? Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for testifying today. You brought up an interesting point that I hadn't considered, and I think your experience is important. So you mentioned that there are people who are sitting by trails who might be suffering from dehydration, which could lead to death. And if they look tired or they look like they need water and you don't help, that would activate this bill. So what this bill would suggest is if someone were hiking or out on a trail and you happen to by them, that you should actually call 911, the police or EMTs, to help them, which might bring up a whole bunch of other different issues. Have you considered that?
Yeah.
Ms. LaRue.
If you were to call 911 in Park County to report a distressed party on a trail, you would go to dispatch. That's the dispatch for our entire sheriff's department. That dispatch would take that information and use it. They would put out a broad call that the sheriff's department would be informed that the dispatch was then sending that call to the search and rescue team for us to handle it. This is what happens currently when someone calls 911. In the case of, I hate to say I cannot remember the young man's name, but about 3 years ago we recovered a body from a young man. And basically, we found him after about 8 months because somebody had reported that his car had been at a trailhead. His family in Kansas had been looking for him. So finally, when his license plate was reported at the trailhead and that went to the Park County Sheriff's dispatch, then we were able to determine that, oh, his family in Nebraska has been looking for him for about 6 weeks. So we began a search for him. It took us 8 months to recover him. These are the consequences of these actions. And I would like to say that, in my opinion, I don't want to see this being a criminalization. We have a lot of educational bills in Colorado where we do a lot of, I don't even have a TV. I haven't had a TV for 20 years and live in the Park County. You're not going to pay $200 a month for Wi-Fi to watch TV when you could be fighting legislative corruption. So,
Ms. LaRue, you need to be respectful and deferential and on point.
I know, but honesty also is a form of respect. And so, opinions, we all have our opinions. We bring them to this table. But I digress. Really, I was at someone's house and I saw a commercial where they were saying, if you see something, say something. And it seemed like a big glorification of the police state. Why couldn't the shift and the focus of that commercial shift to being about helpful citizen interaction instead of saying, turn your neighbor in? Because I went to a meeting in Park County where the Park County Sheriff coerced people to turning their neighbors in for potential marijuana grows. Now, to me, that was actually completely criminal. And I felt that behavior was inappropriate. But if we're going to talk about all this, if you see something, say something mentality, this police state mentality, why can we not use those educational opportunities to talk about the moral obligation to your fellow citizen to do the right thing? Because we have all of this, everything you need to know about marijuana on the CDPHE's website, not one word about anything moral on any of, the state has how many websites? And we don't have any of this covered there, but this would be something that we could probably take the fiscal note from this bill and apply to an educational effort rather than criminal. I've never, ever come to this body and asked you to criminalize somebody. It is not my nature to do so. But I do think that there is a serious disconnect if we're going to use hypocrisy to hide behind not wanting to help people today.
Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
Are there any other witnesses in the chamber who would like to support or oppose this bill? Seeing none, the witness testimony phase is concluded. There is evidently an amendment. Will someone move the amendment for Representative Wilson? Representative Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move L001.
Second. Second by Representative Willett. Is there any questions, clarification of the amendment? You've been speaking to the amendment during the course of the hearing. Are there any questions about the amendment? Is there any objection to the amendment? Seeing none, the amendment 001 is adopted. Any further amendments, committee or Representative Wilson? The amendment phase is closed. Committee, do you have comments? Representative Willett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee members. Thank you, Representative Wilson, and thanks to the people that had the courage to testify on tough issues. You know, lawyers get accused by real people of getting to know. You know, they can get to the conclusion of no. They can always obstruct. They get paid by the word. I just did some quick research, and this issue's been discussed forever in America's history. The common law of England brought it over. In a recent article, there's hundreds of articles on this issue of why do we not have a duty to help, criminal or civil duty to help render assistance. This article I just found, 2008, is 54 pages of discussion about that. Yeah, only lawyers can do this. But it's not out of some sense of wanting to get to know. It's out of a sense of really giving a fair discussion of unintended consequences and how hard these issues can become. And that's what this article talks about. The conclusion alone is 4 pages, and I'm not going to bother you with it. But what I will say is if we're going to do something in this area, it needs to be very skinny. And knowing Representative Wilson like I do, he's a bulldogged, and we're probably going to see it again. So what I would suggest is somebody's really going to have to roll their sleeves up, look at all the thought of all these highly intelligent jurists, judges, lawyers, moralists, to see how and if we can do this. But unfortunately, given a lot of the concerns raised today, and primarily about the structure of this particular bill and the strike below, I'm going to be a reluctant no today.
Further comments? Representative Melton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Wilson, for bringing the bill. I think it is an important discussion that we're having, and I've done some bills around duty to notify, so I do not envy the seat that you're in right now. I have to share my colleagues' concerns that this may have some unintended consequences. Last year we heard, and it kind of got brought up, we heard House Bill 1322, which dealt with domestic violence reports by medical professionals, and how we have victims actually coming and saying, please don't make medical professionals have this duty anymore because it's actually detrimental to us. And I went back and looked at that vote count, and that came out of the House 58-7 with yourself included voting for that. And so when I'm thinking about duty to notify, I think it's a very small needle to thread. It's something that we've got to make sure we're doing what's best for the victim, as well as not creating a problem for those who may be trying to help or those who maybe don't know how to help. And so for that, I hope that we can continue to have this discussion. But as of right now, I will be a no on your bill. But again, I thank you for caring and for really, legislating from the heart.
Representative Weissman.
Thank you. And You know, Rep. Wilson, I think you figured me out pretty early last year. I'm the guy who goes for the statute book or the spreadsheet on most issues. And it's the exceptions that prove the rule. And for me, this bill, in the way that I've been thinking about it, is one of those exceptions. This raises a lot of visceral issues for me. I mean, it's mind-blowing what happened on the river. It really is. The words unfathomable and unconscionable were used, and I subscribe to those. It's unfathomable and unconscionable what happened on the river and the other things that we've heard about. You know, a couple of years ago, before I was part of this institution, I had gotten up early one morning to go up to Bar Lake State Park, that you may know. It's a good spot to watch birds. And then I was driving down Highway 2 to come into Denver for work. And right in front of me, a white pickup truck had some problem on the pavement, rolled over, went into the ditch at about 40 miles an hour. I slammed on the brakes, I pulled over, I ran across the road, I ran down in the ditch into a cloud of black flies, and I pulled out my phone and I called. And I stayed with the folks for quite a while until a number of police cars and emergency vehicles showed up. And there was absolutely no question in my mind that that's what I needed to do, because I was the first person who observed that happen. It was one car in front of me. And there's no question that the only right thing to do in that situation, or any of these other ones we've been talking about, was that same thing: to stop, to try to help, and to make the call. And if, as we've talked about, there's no reception, to go and do the next best thing you can, whatever that is. You know, to the idea that somebody's indifference is more important than a life. Speaking for myself, and I think others here, I do want to send a message out for whoever's listening here that, no, we reject that. We do not condone indifference. You know, for people who choose the path of indifference, I think, you know, morally, ethically, there's a reckoning for them, and that's between themselves and their conscience or their God or whatever. You know, I think a lot of my colleagues here of either party raised most of the issues that, in a more legalistic way, I would have raised. You know, the bill that we alluded to, 1322 last year, I'll be honest, I was initially, I was leaning no on that bill. And then I really dug in, and I came to understand in that context, which is different than this context, you know, the importance of the choice and the right to maybe not be reported. And I helped fix some drafting issues and helped try to get that bill passed for the sponsor. You know, another issue that I don't think we really talked about is because this is written broadly, could actually apply to the wrongdoer, him or herself, in a criminal context, which raises Fifth Amendment self-incrimination issues. Something I've been thinking a lot about since the summer is the issue of what we call collateral consequences of crimes. You have something on your record, you're never out of the shadow. It's going to impact getting work, it's going to impact getting housing, it's going to impact providing for your family, it's going to impact staying off of public supports, it's going to impact a whole lot of things. And even in this kind of awful, painful case, we need to think about that. And, you know, I'm afraid of, you know, what might happen to the 911 system for where it's needed. It's needed here, clearly. You know, I spent a day visiting with one of my fire departments in my district, Cunningham Fire, which operates under Title 32. And boy, they get all manner of people calling 911 and tying up lines for stuff that I couldn't have believed until I walked in that day. I do fear that something like this goes on the books. You know, somebody slips on ice on the sidewalk in the winter. Do I need to call? I honestly don't know. I don't think anybody honestly knows. I don't want to jam up the line so that when the really nasty stuff happens, you know, help can't be sent. So, you know, there's nothing good about what happened on the Arkansas River and what happened with Mr. Ashby. And clearly you feel terrible about it, and that's motivating you to bring this bill, and I feel terrible about it too. And I still can't be convinced that to criminalize that for whatever incomprehensible reason, that not reporting, I don't think this is the right law to put on our books. So I can't support it today, but doesn't mean it's not an awful issue.
Representative Herod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for bringing this bill. As I mentioned, when I first saw this bill, I thought of what I've been seeing on social media, which is truly abhorrent and is very upsetting to me. But as I heard Representative Weissman's story, I'm reminded of a time recently, just this past year, when I was traveling south on I-25 to visit my family, and actually Chairman Lee was there. I was trying to get down there to meet up with him as well, and there was a car driving erratically in front of me, and all of a sudden, he flew through the air, rolled over 3 times, and ended up in the median on I-25. Immediately, I stopped. So did a lot of other people. He was pinned underneath the car. I tried to call 911, couldn't get through. That meant a lot of Coloradans, a lot of people on the roads were calling 911 to help this man. All of a sudden, out of all of these cars came at least 20 men who picked up the vehicle, the truck, and pulled this guy from underneath it. You also saw nurses and EMTs who were off duty and soldiers for sure who jumped out of their cars, who ran to help this man, started doing life-saving procedures. Best I could do was give them my scarf and pray with the folks who were praying. And I just remember that scene and how at least 30 or 40 people stopped on a busy I-25, got out of their cars, and tried to help. That's the Coloradan that I think of. That's the Coloradan that I know. And that's what I want to think about, not the folks I've seen online or these other things that are going on. So when I think about that, though, I have to think about those folks also who didn't stop and what requirements there are for them to then call or to offer life-saving procedures. I also think about the young woman that I described to you earlier, the survivor, and how she might or he might go to a friend and say, this just happened to me, bloodied, in need of help, and says, I don't want to go forward. And how that then criminalizes, I know we said this, we don't want to see a criminalization bill, but this is a criminalization bill, criminalizes that friend for not calling and then re-victimizes the survivor as well, right? She becomes the witness in this case. And I think that that is something that we can't see happen here. We can't see it happen here in Colorado. And so for that reason, I can't support this bill today, but I do appreciate your efforts. I do appreciate why you're doing this. And I'm very sorry about what happened on the river. That should never happen. And I know that those folks are living with that. And I have to think that they are suffering as well, that they are doing a lot of time for watching this happen. But this is not the right remedy for that situation, and for that, I'm going to be a no vote.
Representative Benavides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Wilson, for bringing this. I don't want to reiterate my colleagues' comments that this was certainly a worthy bill to bring. It's just the language is a little broad. And it's not, one of the things I've learned being on this committee, this is my second year on it, that this committee really strives to get very precise language in these bills, especially because people can be held criminally liable and potentially in this bill civilly liable for their actions or their failure to act in this case. I think I certainly, after hearing some of the stories, what happened to Eric, and I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, with your daughter, a bill that would require people that are in the situation with someone to, that they have a relationship, whether they were in the accident, that whether they were on the rafting trip with them, that they would have a responsibility in narrowing it to them, but this is much broader than that. So because of that and because of just some of the language in the bill, I won't be able to support it today.
Representative Salazar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Wilson. This is a tough bill. I mean, hearing the testimony here today, I mean, it broke my heart. You know, human beings can be absolutely beautiful. and the way that we respond and heroic in the testimony that you've heard from these committee members in terms of seeing accidents. And human beings can be completely indifferent to human life. There's a delicate balance somewhere in there, right? I drive I-25 pretty much every day to get here to the Capitol. Every day I see accidents. Every day. And every day I see a variety of severity in the accidents, from the very serious ones. I saw an accident not too long ago where this guy, he was rear-ended and it flipped his vehicle, and I saw him fly right out of the vehicle as it was flipping, and he laid right there in the middle of the street. Horrified me, and I got on the phone to 911 and made the call, as well as so did so many other people. So many other people stopped as we got out to see the condition of the man. But there were so many other people who drove by. We have cameras everywhere, all over the streets. So each of those individuals who didn't make a phone call would be criminalized under your bill. And that's a difficult pill to swallow. It's also, as Representative Wiseman said, that would clog up the system, especially being on I-25 at any particular time during rush hour. There could literally be hundreds to thousands of people watching something happening. And if all of them didn't call, then that criminalizes those individuals. Also, as I indicated earlier, we passed laws. We passed a repeal last year of mandatory reporting, and that was at the behest of Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And what this bill does is it upends everything that we did last year. We do have in our laws, and thanks to Representative Robert Zanubi on this committee, he cited 42-4-1606, a duty to report accidents. And that's if a driver of a vehicle involved in an accident results in an injury or serious bodily injury, that person has a duty to report. It doesn't say the whole world does, but that person does because they were involved in the accident. And that's a Class 2 misdemeanor if they fail to do it. And then we have 18-8115, a duty to report a crime, where it says it is the duty of every corporation or person who has reasonable grounds to believe that a crime has been committed to report promptly the suspected crime to law enforcement authorities. So in some ways, we do have laws that have some type of duty to call. This one here is just a little bit overly broad. As I indicated, Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they're opposed to this bill. And another group is Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, because we have a lot of people who come here from different countries, whether lawfully or unlawfully, but they come here from a lot of different countries where they're concerned about law enforcement, and they're concerned about the law enforcement that we have here in this country, and so many of them don't report. And now we've criminalized those individuals too. This is a very dangerous way to approach the bill. There's probably a different way of crafting this language that tries to get at what you're trying to get at, but it's not through the original bill or this amendment. I really appreciate your valiant efforts in trying to address and remedy the wrongs that were testified to by family members, and I'm going to be a no vote. Thank you.
Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wilson, I value and cherish you as a colleague tremendously. I admire your spirit. I admire your passion for the issues that you work on. For the reasons that my colleagues have expressed, I think there's a needle to be threaded here. I think it may be somewhere within the confines of the strike below, perhaps 2B, whether it's in the context of this being a factor that could be utilized in charging or creating some deterrent to people who are engaged in specific conduct that causes another person to need emergency assistance and then failure to provide that assistance. So I think there's further work to be done here. I appreciate you picking this up, and I appreciate the very thoughtful and passionate testimony from the witnesses today. I'll be a respectful no on the bill and encourage you to keep working on it. Thank you.
Representative Lundin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Wilson, for bringing this bill. When you started in your presentation, you said, let's not discuss what's wrong with this bill, but what's right. And the lawyers have done what lawyers do, and they've worked through it, and they've rightfully and properly called out some really serious challenges and the identification of unintended consequences that would be, quite honestly, maybe damaging to us all. And that's important. But I heard also in the course of that conversation that there is possibly a legal way forward, a narrowing, a tapering, a threading the needle, so to speak. But I saw also today a real win in this bill. And that is the fact that it is one more point of communication around this issue. It is one more lever bar on the perspective of society. And I got to tell you, there are few people that carry a lever bar on changing the perspective of society more effectively, Representative Wilson, than do you. So, although it is with a heavy heart for the victims that have suffered because people have failed to come to their aid when they should have, and it is with a reluctance to, in fact, not be able to join in lockstep with you in the effort that you have through the context of this bill, I will support to my dying breath the effort in what you are trying to do, but I will regretfully be a no on this bill today.
Representative Salazar.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move House Bill 1059 to the Committee of the Whole.
Second by Representative Wilt. Would you like to make a closing statement, Representative Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure it'll make a whole lot of difference, but as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. So I'd like for you to listen carefully to what I have to say. First of all, thanks to the committee for educating me in Legalese 101. I was surprised that no one called 911 to rescue me in this situation. Thanks to Mr. Pogue for all his help and his willingness to even set up. We thought we would have a video, but we did not have that. The good news, I suppose, is I may get a unanimous vote out of the judiciary, which is kind of tough to do. This is an emotional issue, and I think that the thing I would like for you to understand, in fact, there's a few of them, and you'll have to bear with me because I have my prepared notes for the intro, and then you have to write in the margins, as you all know, for the rest. But people are getting fed up. I don't want that to be lost on this committee. 60,000 signatures in 20 days is unbelievable. The folks back in Tennessee, I believe, or Florida, whichever, where they started this, where Eric came from, they were upset with Miss Morris because she had this many signatures here. They only had about 4,500 to 5,000 there, and they said that just kind of killed our petition. The people here are fed up with it. I think, as Representative Lundin said, it's time we started looking for the right things instead of what could be wrong. I personally am very upset that my mules have more people concerned about them than my granddaughter. I've literally had calls on my mules. Well, I'm not sure that he's taking good care of those mules. There's something there. Rhode Island, Vermont, I mean, they must be doing something right. So maybe that's where we look to find the verbiage that would work for Colorado. But I would say that if it's working the way that I've heard that this would have to work here, that there's an opportunity when you all finish up this high-paying job here of being a representative that you could go and be an attorney in Rhode Island or Vermont and live comfortably for the rest of your life. But I don't think that's the case. It's amazing to me, folks. I just heard on the news this morning, I believe it was the news this morning while I was working out, somebody in Colorado passed a law about smoking in cars because that's not healthy. I'd rather have one person charged with a misdemeanor than make one person become a statistic. And Representative Weissman, you pointed out about that you can't get out of the shadow of a record. I understand that. You can't get out from the shadow of a fatality, of a loss of a loved one, ever, ever. Unintended consequences? The unintended consequences in this situation we call fatalities. And there's something wrong with that. And as I said, I went through a lot of emotions on this. I was not attached to this when I started. They say, don't marry a bill, just carry it. So I just try to engage a bill and don't go down the aisle with it. But I started down there with this one after I got thinking about what we do and the lives that are lost. And it's just not right. So I'll finish with this little rhyme, which doesn't surprise Representative Lundeen. Today, our approach seems to be drive on by, let them die. I think we should just vote aye and give common sense a try. So I ask for an aye vote. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Wilson, for your impassioned and deliberate support of your bill. Mr. Pogue, please take the roll.
Representatives Benavidez,
No.
Carver,
With great respect for my colleague, no.
Harrod,
No.
Lundeen,
No.
Melton,
Respectfully, no.
Roberts,
No.
Weissman,
Respectfully, no.
Willett,
No.
Wist,
No.
Salazar.
No.
Mr. Chairman,
No. The bill fails 0 to 11. Committee will take a 10-minute,
No,
oh, excuse me. Representative Salazar.
Mr. Chair, I move House Bill 1059 be postponed indefinitely.
Second.
Second by Representative Melton. Mr. Pogue, hold the committee.
Representatives Benavidez,
Yes.
Carver,
Yes.
Harrod,
Yes.
Lundeen,
Yes.
Melton,
Yes.
Roberts,
Yes.
Weissman,
Yes.
Willett,
Yes.
Wist,
Yes.
Salazar.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
11-0.
That motion passes by a vote of 11 to 0. Thank you, Representative Wilson. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You nearly robbed me of my second unanimous vote today.
Thank you. The committee will take a 10-minute recess.